Hi everyone. So for the first time in a very long time, I've decided to talk about Atlantis again. So if you've seen my previous videos about this subject, you'll know that I argue that the Minoan civilization was the origin for the legend of Atlantis. But recently I've been doing a lot more research into this because of some professional writing work that I've been doing about Atlantis. And I came across some things which have kind of blown my mind in a way and has changed the way that I look at Plato's account. So I happened to come across this book which also argues for the Minoan theory, but in a way that I had never seen it presented before. And it sort of called into question something that I had always assumed was the case, and I think pretty much everyone else had assumed was the case, but it's not actually stated in Plato's account. So it's not the only possible interpretation. I'll explain what I mean in a moment, but so just to explain how I had previously presented the Minoan theory, it was like this. So Plato describes Atlantis as being the way to other islands, and from those islands you would reach the opposite continent which surrounded the true sea. So I understood the true sea to be the Mediterranean, and Plato contrasts this with a harbour-like sea, which is inside the Pillars of Heracles. So my theory was, it's not unique to me, but the theory that I argued for is that the two headlands either side of the Gulf of Laconia in southern Greece are the Pillars of Heracles. So the sea inside that is the Gulf of Laconia, so that's the harbour-like sea. It really is like a harbour. And outside the Pillars of Heracles, you have the true sea, and that's the sea that Atlantis was in, and that's the sea that was surrounded by this boundless continent, which is Eurasia plus Africa. It's all one mainland, all connected. So that was my understanding of it. The problem is that it doesn't really work with everything that Plato says. So for example, there's a bit where he describes how Atlantis conquered the territory within the Pillars of Heracles, Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tehania in Italy. So he clearly places the North African coast and European coast within the Pillars of Heracles. So the idea that the sea within the Pillars of Heracles is the Gulf of Laconia and the sea outside, the true sea, is the Mediterranean, well, that doesn't really work. So my best explanation for that was that this was just due to some confusion that was introduced along the line of transmission of the story in regards to what the Pillars of Heracles were. Because the more common understanding in ancient times as well as modern times is that they were on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar. So everything inside the Mediterranean is inside the Pillars of Heracles. And so due to confusion between that location as the Pillars of Heracles and the Gulf of Laconia as the Pillars of Heracles, you've got these statements from Plato which aren't quite consistent with my understanding of the Minoan theory. So that was my best explanation. I wasn't able to make it work perfectly. But I read this, I came across this book as I was researching recently, which highlighted an assumption. So, like I said, I had understood the reference to Atlantis controlling one main island, from which you'd go to several others, and then there was the continent which surrounded the true sea. My understanding, and I think pretty much everyone else's understanding, is that the true sea that the continent surrounds is the sea in which Atlantis is located. So, for example, according to the traditional understanding, you've got the Mediterranean. Atlantis is outside the Mediterranean, and beyond Atlantis there are several other islands, and from those islands you'll reach the opposite continent, which surrounds the true sea. The true sea itself being like the world-encircling ocean that the Greeks believed in. So the continent, when it says the continent surrounded the true sea, it's talking about surrounding the sea that Atlantis was in. That's the understanding I always see. That was my understanding. So the continent would have to surround the sea that the Minoans were in, which would be the Mediterranean. However, in reality, there is not a single line in Plato's account which actually says that the true sea that was surrounded by the boundless continent was the sea that Atlantis was in. There is not a single line that says that. And yet it's something that pretty much everyone has always assumed. But it's just that, it's just an assumption. It's not the only possible interpretation of Plato's words. So, for example, imagine if you reach the opposite continent and the part of the continent you reach is the inner part, then yes, the sea that it surrounds would have to be the sea that the islands are already in. However, if you were to reach the outer edge, the outer rim of the continent, then that means that it surrounds a sea in that direction. It's something that I'd never really thought of, and it might seem a bit arbitrary, a bit confusing, but in terms of real-world geography, it makes perfect sense. So what this author suggests is that the sea, the true sea, which is surrounded by the continent, is the Black Sea. Not the Mediterranean Sea, not the Atlantic Sea, but the Black Sea. So from the Minoan Islands, well, from Crete particularly, you would go to the other islands of the Aegean, and then you'd reach the opposite continent, which is Asia Minor or Thrace. In either case, it's Eurasia, which then surrounds the true sea, the Black Sea. So the true sea is not the same as the sea that Atlantis was in. Plato never says that it is. So this interpretation enables you to have a different sea being the true sea, while the territory of North Africa and the European coast, that's within the Pillars of Heracles, in a sea which is distinct from the true sea, while still preserving the Minoan theory. I thought that was such a brilliant idea, and it really calls into question the fact that this is just an assumption. It's not stated directly in Plato's text that the sea that Atlantis was in was the true sea. Never stated. So it's not the only possible interpretation. So this new interpretation I thought was such an amazing idea. It doesn't quite work, though, this author's theory, because they place the Pillars of Heracles as being at basically the entrance to the Black Sea, around the region of Troy, which is where Socrates placed them. Because the Pillars of Heracles seem to have denoted limits, such as limits of geographical knowledge or activity or Greek territory. So you've got the Strait of Gibraltar on one end, and you've got the entrance to the Black Sea on the other end. Socrates specifically says that it was to mark the limit of Greek territory in Heracles' time. So with that perspective, you've got the true sea being outside, or beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and the Mediterranean Sea, where Atlantis was, according to this Minoan theory, inside the Pillars of Heracles. So it's a great idea, but it doesn't quite work, because Plato does specifically say that the war between Athens and Atlantis was a war between those outside the Pillars of Heracles and those inside. And yet, if we place the Pillars of Heracles at the entrance to the Black Sea, then neither the Minoans nor the Greeks would be outside of that. So that doesn't quite work. But I believe I've discovered the explanation for that. In fact, I believe that I have, now that this author had kind of made me aware of the fact that there are some things which are just assumptions, I re-examined Plato's account, and I started thinking, what are the assumptions here? And is there another possible interpretation? And so I think I've created an explanation for how the Minoans match perfectly the geography described in Plato's account. No mistakes, no confusions, no multiple Pillars of Heracles, just one consistent explanation that fits everything Plato describes. However, I do very much want to give credit to this previous author who came up with this explanation regarding the true sea, because that was the key which made me realize Plato's account needs to be re-examined and the assumptions need to be questioned. So in a future video I'll present my theory, But for now, let me know what you think in the comments below.